Have you ever held something old? A weathered photograph, a faded letter, a book with cracked leather and pages that smell of dust and time? There's a weight to these things, isn't there? A sense that they have seen more than we ever will. They hold stories, not just in the words written on them, but in their very fibers. The oldest scrolls of the Bible are like that, but infinitely more so. They are not just ancient documents. They are records of a conversation between God and humanity, a conversation filled with love, but also with pain, with longing, and with a deep, resonant ache that you can almost feel trembling through the parchment. This ache is the sound of a world that is not yet as it should be. It is the echo of humanity's first wrong turn and the long, winding road back home. We often read these texts looking for clear answers, for simple rules, for a straightforward map, but the scrolls offer something much more profound. They offer a story, a relationship, and like any real relationship, it is complicated. It has moments of breathtaking clarity and moments of profound mystery. It is filled with promises kept and hearts broken. This tension, this ache is not a flaw in the text. It is the heartbeat of the story. Some manuscripts seem to hide this pain. They present a cleaner, more direct narrative. They smooth over the rough edges and present a story that feels more resolved, more certain. Perhaps the scribes who copied them felt they were protecting God's reputation or making the path clearer for the reader. But in doing so, they sometimes quieted the very thing that makes the story so powerful. They muffled the sound of a God who is willing to wait, to grieve, and to enter into the messiness of our world. The ache is the evidence of his patience, the proof that he has not given up on us. Other manuscripts, however, let the ache breathe. They preserve the difficult questions, the confusing timelines, the moments where heaven seems silent. These texts don't shy away from the struggle. They invite us into it. They show us a God who is not afraid of our doubts or our pain. In these scrolls, we find a different kind of comfort, not the comfort of easy answers, but the comfort of knowing we are not alone in our questions. The ache is a signpost, pointing us toward a deeper mystery, a mercy that is bigger than we could have imagined. It tells us there is more to the story than what we see on the surface. We all know the name Methuselah. He is the oldest man in the Bible, a symbol of impossible longevity. We see the number 969 years, and we marvel. We might even question it, but we rarely ask why. Why did he live so long? Was it just a random detail, a testament to a healthier ancient world? Or was something else going on? To understand, we have to look at his name. In ancient Hebrew, names were not just labels, they were prophecies. They were stories packed into a single word. And Methuselah's name is believed to mean something astonishing. When he dies, it shall be sent. Think about that for a moment. When he dies, it shall be sent. What was to be sent? The very next story in the book of Genesis gives us the answer. The great flood. The flood that would wash the world clean of its violence and corruption. Methuselah's entire life was a countdown. Every breath he took was a measure of God's patience. Every year he lived was another year of grace extended to a world spiraling out of control. His long life was not a biological anomaly. It was a profound act of mercy. It was God holding back judgment, giving humanity every possible second to turn back. His name was not a threat. It was a promise of delay. It was a whisper of hope in a world that had grown deaf to God's voice. For 969 years, God waited. He waited while Methuselah's son, Lamech, was born. He waited while his grandson Noah was born. He waited while Noah grew up, found a wife, and had 3 sons of his own. He waited while Noah preached and pleaded with his generation. The story of Methuselah is the story of a God who is slow to anger, whose patience is wider and deeper than any ocean. His life is a testament to the idea that God's silence is not always absence. Sometimes it is mercy. So that famous number 969 is not just a statistic about age, it is a measure of grace. It tells us that God's first instinct is not to punish, but to wait. It reveals a heart that is willing to postpone justice in the hope of repentance. The story of Methuselah challenges us to see numbers in the Bible not just as data, but as poetry. They can hold history, prophecy, and in this case, a staggering display of divine mercy. His life wasn't just long. It was a long and beautiful pause, a final, lingering breath before the rains began to fall. To understand the hidden aches in the Bible, we need to know where our Old Testament comes from. For most of us, it comes from a manuscript tradition called the Masoretic text. This is a collection of Hebrew scrolls meticulously preserved by Jewish scribes, mostly between the 7th and 10th centuries AD. The Masoretes were brilliant and dedicated. They created a system of dots and dashes to preserve the pronunciation of ancient Hebrew, ensuring the text could be read accurately for generations. Their work is a gift to the world, a direct line to the ancient words of the prophets and kings of Israel. But the Masoretic text is not the only witness we have. Long before the Masoretes did their work, another version of the Hebrew scriptures existed. Around the 3rd century BC, the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek in Alexandria, Egypt. This translation is called the Septuagint, often abbreviated as LXX, the Roman numeral for 70, after the legend of the 72 scholars who produced it. The Septuagint was the Bible of the early Christian church. When the Apostle Paul or the Gospel writers quoted the Old Testament, they were most often quoted from this Greek version. It is an incredibly important part of how the scriptures were understood before and during the time of Jesus. The fascinating thing is that these two texts, the Masoretic and the Septuagint, are not always identical. They tell the same backstory. The God of Abraham is the same. The covenant is the same. The promise of the Messiah is the same. Two different witnesses to the same event, each remembering a slightly different detail, each emphasizing a different aspect of what happened. Comparing these two ancient traditions is like looking at a sculpture from two different angles. One angle might reveal the strength in the subject's jawline, while the other reveals the sorrow in their eyes. The Masoretic text often feels more concise, more contained, more focused on the story of Israel. The Septuagint, on the other hand, sometimes feels more robust, more expansive, and even more revealing of the messianic threads running through the text. Both are part of the story, the sacred is where we find some of the deepest treasures. Let's look at a concrete example of how these two scroll traditions differ. It involves a detail that seems small, but it has enormous implications. In the Gospel of Luke, we find the genealogy of Jesus. Luke traces Jesus' lineage all the way back to Adam to show that he's the savior for all of humanity. When Luke lists the ancestors between Noah's son Shem and Abraham, he includes a man named Canaan. He writes that Arphaxad was the father of Canaan, and Canaan was the father of Shelah. This seems straightforward enough. But if you turn back to the book of Genesis in most modern Bibles, which are based on the Masoretic text, and look at that same genealogy, you will find that Canaan is missing. The Masoretic text says that Arphaxad was the father of Shelah directly. The man has vanished. So, where did Luke get this name? He got it from the Septuagint. In the Greek translation of Genesis, Canaan is right there, listed just as Luke records him. For centuries, readers of the Greek Bible knew of Canaan. Readers of the Hebrew Bible did not. Why would a name be removed? We can only speculate. Perhaps a scribe in the Masoretic tradition made a simple copying error, his eye skipping from one name to the next. Or perhaps it was intentional. Some scholars suggest that Jewish scribes after the time of Christ were uncomfortable with details in the Septuagint that seemed to support Christian claims. Removing a name or changing a number could have been a way to create distance from the version of the scriptures used by the early church. It could have been an attempt to seal up the text, to protect it from what they saw as misinterpretation. Whatever the reason, the absence of Canaan in one tradition and his presence in another is a perfect example of the ache in the text. It's a seam, a point of tension. It reminds us that the Bible we hold in our hands has a dramatic and very human history. It wasn't facts from heaven. It was copied by hand, translated, and defended by people who deeply loved it. The story of the missing Canaan isn't a reason to doubt the Bible. It's an invitation to be curious, to ask questions, and to appreciate the incredible journey these words have taken to reach us today. It shows that sometimes the story is found not Let's return to Methuselah and his astonishing age. The story gets even more interesting when we compare the numbers in our two ancient scrolls. As we saw, his name meant, "When he dies, it shall be sent." The Masoretic text, the one our Bibles are based on, gives us a very precise timeline. Methuselah lived 969 years. He had his son Lamech at age 187. Lamech had his son Noah at age 182. If you add it all up, the flood comes in the 600th year of Noah's life. And when does Methuselah die? Exactly the same year the flood began. His life ends and the judgment arrives, just as his name predicted. It's a perfect, almost mathematical fulfillment. But the Septuagint, the Greek version, tells a slightly different story. The numbers are different. In the Septuagint, Methuselah still lives 969 years. But the ages at which the patriarchs had their sons are shifted. According to the Septuagint's math, Methuselah would have died 14 years after the flood began. This seems like a contradiction, a problem. How could he have survived the flood if he wasn't on the ark? This is where that textual ache sings its most beautiful song. The early church fathers looked at this number and saw something incredible. They didn't see a mistake. They saw mercy. They suggested that God, in his great compassion, did not allow this righteous man, whose very life was a symbol of God's patience, to witness the terrifying judgment that fell upon the world. In their reading of the Septuagint, God took Methuselah to be with him before the floodwaters came. The number wasn't an error to be corrected. It was a detail that revealed the tenderness of God's character. It showed a God who not only delays judgment for the wicked, but also shelters the righteous from the horror of it. So which one is right? The Masoretic text, with its perfect clockwork precision, where Methuselah dies the year of the flood, or the Septuagint, with its story of a merciful God taking his faithful servant home before the tragedy? Perhaps the question isn't which is right, but what does each story teach us? One shows us the unerring precision of God's prophetic word. The other shows us the depths of his mercy and compassion. Both reveal the difference. In the heart of ancient Israel's worship stood the temple, and in the heart of the temple was a room called the Holy of Holies. This was the place where God's presence was said to dwell on earth, but no one could simply walk in. It was separated from the rest of the temple by a thick, heavy curtain, a veil. This veil was a powerful symbol. It represented the separation between a holy God and a sinful humanity. It was a constant, woven reminder of the ache, of the distance that sin had created. It was beautiful, but it was also a barrier. The veil was a form of hiding. It concealed the full glory of God because, in our fallen state, we could not endure it. This hiding was not an act of rejection, but an act of protection. It was mercy. The Masoretic text, with its focus on order, law, and the holiness of God, gives us a profound sense of the veil's importance. It describes its construction, its purpose, and the strict rules about who could pass through it, and only once a year. The Masoretic tradition helps us feel the weight of that separation, the awesome and honestly, the terrifying holiness of God. It seals the mystery behind the curtain. But then we come to the New Testament. The Gospels tell us that at the very moment Jesus died on the cross, the veil in the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. This was not a random act of destruction. It was a divine statement. The barrier was broken. The way into God's presence was now open to everyone through Jesus. The Septuagint, being the text of the early church, helps us read the Old Testament with this event in mind. It helps us see the threads of promise that pointed toward this moment all along. It reveals what the veil was always meant to point toward, a day when it would no longer be needed. The torn veil is the ultimate answer to the ache we find in the scrolls. The Masoretic text emphasizes the holiness that required the veil, making its tearing all the more shocking and significant. The Septuagint tradition, read through the eyes of the early Christians, helps us see the promise of restoration that was always waiting for us. One scroll helps us understand the depth of the separation, the other helps us grasp the scope of the solution, and helps us to the story needs more than the ache of the veil gives way to the wonder of its tearing. It might seem like these debates over ancient scrolls are just for scholars in dusty libraries, but they are not. The same passions, the same desire for certainty, and honestly, the same defensiveness exists today among people who love the Bible. Have you ever been in a conversation where someone declares that only one specific translation of the Bible is the correct one? Whether it's the King James Version, the New International Version, or any other, the argument is often the same. This one is the most accurate. The others are flawed or have taken something out. This impulse is understandable. We want to be sure that we are hearing God's voice clearly. We are afraid of being led astray, so we cling to the version that feels safest, the one we trust the most. We defend it fiercely, sometimes pointing out the errors or omissions in other translations. We might point to a missing verse in a modern version compared to the King James, without realizing that this difference often goes back to the very same manuscript debates we have been discussing. A choice between the Masoretic text and other ancient witnesses like the Septuagint. But in this battle for certainty, we often miss the point. We miss the ache. We treat the Bible like a perfect, flawless instruction manual instead of a living, breathing story with a complex and beautiful history. When we attack another translation, we are often unknowingly attacking a different scribal tradition that also sought to honor God. We flatten the text, ignoring the rich tensions that give it so much depth. We miss the story of Canaan's name, or the different ways Methuselah's age can be understood. We demand a single, simple note when the original music was a chord, full of harmony and tension. The truth is, every translation is an act of interpretation. It involves choices. The translators must decide which manuscript tradition to follow on a given verse, and how best to render ancient Hebrew or Greek into a modern language. A good translation is not one that has no flaws, but one that faithfully conveys the meaning and power of the original story. Instead of fighting over our favorite versions, perhaps we should be more curious. Perhaps we should ask why they are different, and what each difference might teach us about the God they describe. One of the greatest dangers in how we read the Bible today is the habit of proof texting. This is when we pull a single verse out of its context to prove a point. We use it like a weapon in an argument or a simple slogan on a coffee mug. We treat the Bible like a collection of inspirational quotes rather than a grand, unfolding narrative. We take a small patch of fabric and ignore the beautiful, ancient garment it was cut from. This practice not only weakens our arguments, but it dishonors the very text we are trying to uphold. A verse, when isolated, can lose its true meaning. It can even be made to say the opposite of what the author intended. The Bible's power is not in these isolated patches, but in the sweep of its story. It is in the way themes develop from Genesis to Revelation. It is in the way the ache of separation in the early chapters finds its resolution in the final ones. To understand a verse, we need to understand the paragraph, the chapter, and the book it belongs to. We need to understand the story of the people to whom it was first written. Think about our examples. If you just pull out Methuselah lived 969 years without understanding the meaning of his name and the context of the coming flood, it's just a strange fact. But when you see it as a countdown of mercy, it becomes one of the most moving stories of God's patience. If you only look at the rules for the temple veil, you might see God as distant and inaccessible. But if you see it in the context of the whole story, culminating in its tearing, you see a God who is drawing near. The patches by themselves cannot carry this weight. When we reduce the Bible to a list of proof texts, we lose the ache, we lose the tension, we lose the humanity in the drama, we trade a profound, complex story for a set of simple, easy answers. And in doing so, we miss the value of something. It is in the arc of the story of a patient God who waits, who makes promises, who enters into our mess, and who ultimately tears down the barrier between us. That is a story far too big to fit on a bumper sticker. So what do we do with all of this? With the different scrolls, the missing names, the conflicting numbers, the ache that trembles through the pages? Do we throw up our hands in confusion? Do we abandon the search for truth? No, we do the opposite. We lean in, we embrace the mystery. We accept the invitation to become seekers, not just readers. There is a verse in the book of Proverbs that says, "It is the glory of God to conceal a matter, to search out a matter is the honor of kings." Perhaps some truths in the Bible are not laid bare on the surface for a reason. Perhaps they are hidden for us to find, not because God is trying to trick us, but because the act of searching changes us. The process of wrestling with the text, of asking hard questions, of comparing the ancient witnesses is what builds real faith. A faith that is handed to us on a silver platter is fragile, but a faith that we have fought for, that has been tested by doubt and curiosity, is strong. It becomes our own. The ache in the scrolls is not a sign of their unreliability, it is a sign of their honesty. It is the echo of a real historical journey. It is proof that God chose to work through fallible, passionate, questioning human beings to tell his story. He did not erase their fingerprints from the pages. He let the tensions remain, inviting us to explore them. He invites us to feel the weight of Methuselah's long wait, to wonder about Canaan's disappearance, and to stand in awe before the torn veil. So the next time you open your Bible, I challenge you to listen for the ache. Don't just read the words, feel their weight. Look for the tension, ask questions. Wonder why one scroll says one thing and another says something different. Don't be afraid of the mystery, for it is in searching out these matters that we find our honor. And it is in the heart of that ache, in the center of that tension, that we often find the most breathtaking glimpses of God's hidden, relentless, and beautiful mercy. The treasure is there, waiting for those who are willing to dig.